thanks everyone for coming to listen to us today. I will try to be as brief as I can to introduce some kind of fairly complex ideas, but hopefully somewhat interesting. So I'm going to talk today about predominantly the work in a forthcoming publication called On the Politics of Design Frames, which is due to come out next year in Design Issues. And then I will talk about the kind of conceptual ideas laid out in that paper through the work that I've been leading through the project Counterframing Design, Radical Design Practices for Sustainability and Social Change for the last year and a half or so with some collaborators. I should want to also acknowledge the team behind Counterframing Design, some of who have contributed ideas that I will talk about today. So in particularly Dr. Anais Parada and Dr. Pandora Shiperick and Vicky Gerard. Okay, so from a project perspective, I should say also that we're funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council to undertake this research. So we are very grateful for that funding. The strategic aim of the project is to develop a new design approach, working with grassroots organizations and community organizations to use design to develop strategic approaches to social change. So this is the broad general purpose of the work. More conceptually, we are developing a conception of counteraction design, which is informed by a kind of a critical deconstruction of the idea of design frames as kind of established in design theory. And we develop a kind of a conceptual response that we describe as counterframes, which we try to understand as a route to challenging normative understandings of social issues, in the literature described as institutionalized frames, which are informed by common sense frames and discourses, which hopefully will become a little clearer as I work through the talk. In the paper, the conceptual paper, our intention is to theorize how design practices are always political. And we do this with a focus on the specific practice of design framing, framing the problem, and developing frame statements. And our paper is kind of oriented and builds on just a handful of papers that already express some kind of reservations about the established or normative understanding of design framing in design theory, namely Keshavarz and Mazet, Kubrick et al., Ajid, and more recently Williams. So in our project, what we mean by the political is if we understand frames as socio-material things, we can begin to understand them as conditioning and conditioned, and as such having the capacity to foreclose, direct, or open up social processes and outcomes, and in doing so, suppress or reveal dissensus. So in the paper, we start with an articulation of the state of the art in design frames. We then build a critical response and present a new conceptualization. So firstly, just to express a little bit about what the kind of standard design theory says about framing, it can be described as a thing or a process. So a thing insofar as it's a statement, which is about the creation of a novel standpoint from which a problematic situation can be tackled. And this is predominantly associated with the work of Kees Dorst, but also others. It can also be understood as a process. So in the paper, we summarize this as a meaning and sense-making activity to build consensus between project beneficiaries through purposefully constructed problem frames or meaning frames that occur within the discrete and time-bound processes of innovation. So equally, we can kind of sum up the literature on design frames as, as it kind of in this way, as a set of, as characterized by having these properties. So in some senses, frames are expressed as statements of intent that are relatively static within the project, but nevertheless evolve with the creative process. They're importantly quite time-bound within the project context, and the literature is fairly assertive about frame making being the preserve of expert designers based on their design skill. They can be quick and dirty, but are also constructed with a certain amount of intention to shape the problem solution space within that project context, and therefore are often following the agendas of whoever is, setting those agendas. Finally, these design frames can often be characterized as consensual because they direct towards a type of solution. So one provocation that we might propose in response is, where does the statement go? So if we think about this socio-materially, and perhaps from an ontological design perspective, bringing in other domains within design theory, such as design anthropology, we can think about, the beyond the life of the project, how the material world is made, and therefore the continuity of the process of stipulated through that framing practice. So they're in an initial challenge to the kind of delimited understanding of frames as conditioned by the time frame of that context. But equally, if we understand frames as doing the work of discourses, we can understand frames as somehow preconditioned, but also conditioning. And this picks up on some of the literature by those more critical design theorists. So in our paper, we develop a response to this design theory by looking outside of the design field to more interdisciplinary perspectives on what framing actually means. And there's a large and relatively well-established domain of literature outside of design on what it means to frame, from cognitive psychology to social movements to institutional theory. And these are effectively the three areas which we try to develop an articulation of the politics of design frames through. So firstly, if we take subjective frames, this is largely coming from cognition or studies of psychology. And this allows us to understand ideas of cognitive biases and the subsequent effects of cognitive biases within our worlds, our lives, sometimes described as the framing effect, also known as prospect theory, which is a very popular theory for how political campaigns can develop messages that elicit certain responses. So this is a very subjective and cognition-based understanding of frames that is not adequately, I guess we propose, integrated within design theory thus far and has relevance. Equally, and perhaps most consequential for the work that we're developing on counteraction design, is this body of knowledge on collective action frames, which speak to the mobilizing nature of frames as having some sort of emotional resonance and developed through social processes between different actor groups, and therefore are always processual, always unfolding, always kind of changing through and with society. They are, of course, dissensual and constructed products to challenge social norms that may be propagated and reproduced through subjective frames or equally institutional frames. So if we think about institutional frames, then these are often understandings that are kind of accepted common sense, effectively. So these are about taken for granted realities that tend to structure expectation in a given context. So expectation in terms of how we behave or act. And can also be described as social fact. But importantly, these manifest through practices and discourses of an institution and its context. So therein play out in the everyday and have some correspondence, of course, then with subjective frames. So whilst we present this as a kind of relatively reductionist schematic, there is always intermingling across these domains. It's not clean and neat, and these kind of concepts are always playing out in the everyday. So there's also within these literatures lots of ongoing debates about the relationship between frames and other concepts such as ideology. For example, Jameson challenges the kind of original work that spoke to cognition frames as effectively politics as marketing. But equally, collective action theorists challenge the work on collective action frames, preferring to speak more of ideology. From a design politics perspective, it's useful to speak about frames because it allows us an entry point to speak about through the language of design to more critical ideas. So in our project, we synthesize this work, conceptual work, to express through theory and also through the empirical work that we've done, our kind of response to the conception of design frames, which we call counterframes, which is a term used sometimes in social movement studies. And whilst these are also intentional things, they are very mutable and change with social processes. We understand them as they're in processual, as very recursive. So counterframes can, as the counter implies, be very oppositional things, but they are also recursive in their opposition, so therefore speak to a more complex understanding of how frames and debates are playing out. So in this sense, they're very discursive, they're embodied, ideological, and dissensual. So in the paper, we then present a re-articulation of the political dimensions of design frames through these three conceptual levels, building substantively on the work of the theorists I've already mentioned at the start of the talk. And perhaps I won't dwell too much on this slide because it will be forthcoming in the paper anyway, and move on a little bit to talk about how we're working with these ideas in the context of our project. Briefly. So within the counter-framing design project, we've been looking a lot at the migrant rights space, which is kind of undergoing a lot of structural change within the UK at the moment through a new immigration bill. But we've been looking at the discourse around migration, which is, complex, hotly contested, and very sensitive area through a critical discourse analysis. So within the work we've done, what we observe is how certain kind of explicit discourses of migration intersect with other discourses around pragmatic action, which then inform how organizations approach their practices of social change. And often we observe is that there is quite a conservative understanding of pragmatism that is informed sometimes by structures of organizations and the need to act urgently in the here and now. As one interviewee expressed, we need to do something to work on something together now. So what we've been trying to do is try to develop a response through our counteraction practice. So in some organizations that maybe ostensibly, or be quite seeking quite democratic decision-making processes with a large community base, when we look closer, sometimes there is foreclosing different types of more radical action. And when I say radical, I mean more radical in the sense of getting to the root of the problem. That also serves to regulate the discourse and therein regulate the frames that can be lead to a particular outcome. So our first example of counteraction then is how we could seek to, that we're developing is a type of an intervention in discourse in a context where discourse is quite regulated by sets of actors, and therefore the kind of the solutions are almost predetermined. So we say that in verticalist organizations that are regulating these discourses fairly heavily, how we need to understand that discourse and how it is produced through language and practice. And our approach is to experiment with different modes of horizontality, so more democratic decision-making structures as an intervention in the discourse. But we also, within the project, are paying attention to some, critiques of horizontal organizing that come from each of our practices. So within the consortium, we have experience of, commons organizing and open source types of distributed design, where we observe a series of kind of deficiencies within this type of horizontalism that lead to sometimes things like disintegration and effectively failure of these types of institutions. So what we're trying to seek then is this integration of this verticalist and horizontal approach in tandem, and this picks up on some fairly recent literature on horizontal experimentalism that is coming out. And the second counteraction, and this is my second last slide, is looking to at how institutional contexts elicit or compel a certain type of frame response based on the types of identities that it kind of compels. So we are seeking to kind of complexify or challenge those situations and the instrumentalization, I suppose, of migrant identities that play into these somehow more pragmatist understandings of social change, and being explicit about how we identify the frontiers or the site of dissensus within this kind of social context. So, for example, in a given institutional context, how the idea of the good immigrant is propagated, produced, and reproduced, and therein who fits the kind of the criteria of a good immigrant, is mutable across different institutional contexts. So how can we surface that as a means to challenge and intervene in these kind of ways of thinking? And this is influenced by certain external factors, so external identification, but also the idea of the observed self. And the oligopticon is a kind of an idea that is the inverse or the antithesis of the panopticon. So the ways in which kind of partial knowledges and consensus based on partial understandings are evolved. So that's a lot of stuff. So just to wrap up, where we are in the project is to developing our understanding of counteraction design. We're developing interventions that are what we see a type of counteraction design intervening in discourse. So we can think conceptually about counteraction as a form of intention through counterframing. If we think of counterframes as socio-material things, following the work of people like Anne-Marie Willis and Tony Fry's ontological designs, whilst we're working within the context of community organizing and collective action, we see the general validity in the wider design innovation field of re-articulating design frames in this way. And we see also the benefit of recentering materiality of frames to allow us to think about the historical nature of those ideas and the future consequences, and or we could describe this as being conditioned and conditioning. So just some references to people that I've find inspiring, and if you'd like to follow the work, you can do so here. Thank you. I should stop sharing.
Thank you, Sharon, for that really fascinating look into your research. What we'd like to do next is invite Cotter into a conversation with you. And before we do that, just wanted to share with everyone that there will be time for Q&A. We're gonna save about 20 minutes towards the end for Q&A. So if you've got questions, please feel free to start putting them into the chat. But for now, what I'd love to do is invite Cotter into this conversation, because we'd like to see how we can start to apply your research, Sharon, to the classroom. Before I even ask questions, Cotter, do you have any comments or feedback you'd like to, or statement you'd like to make first before we dive into questions?
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and thanks so much, Sharon, for sharing the work. I had the pleasure of diving into the article pre-publication recently, and it offers so many different ways to think about how we engage with different publics and create a commons, as we were talking about earlier. In particular, I mean, I'm speaking from my position in particular at the School of Constructed Environments at Parsons, which is a school that includes programs such as architecture, interior design, lighting design, and product design. And oftentimes the work that students do is engaging with communities and thinking about various types of stakeholders. And so, oh, where did I go? And so it's interesting to hear the potential ways in which students can reframe and counterframe some of the ways in which they engage with these different types of communities in their work. And I think where I'm most interested and where some of the things have really struck me is how we think about our institution more generally. So as an educational institution, as one in which many people in this Zoom room engage in socially engaged design practice, how do we apply those same logics to our own institution so that we're empowering students to think critically, reflectively, and bring their own lived experience into the process? So those were some of the ideas that came to me. I think more specifically, in one of your recent articles, you talked a little bit about the pandemic, and I think as an example of how that disruption forced us all to reframe so many ways that we think of things. One example I have from my own teaching is in spring 2020, when we threw out standard grade mechanisms and went with A- system. Instantaneously, it forced us to rethink the value of what those grades even mean in the classroom. So there's some interesting things I think the pandemic has helped us, has revealed and helped us kind of rethink and forced us to create counterframes around the sort of institutional legacies that we've been plagued with, that will hopefully then inspire a generation of designers to take that thinking out to the public. So those were some of the things that struck me right away, and I have others, but I'll stop talking.
Sharon, do you have any thoughts about how Cotter's thinking about your work in the setting of, you know, academia and pedagogy?
Yes, I mean, I guess, you know, correspondingly to Cotter's example about the grades, I mean, you know, we restructured our institutions relatively overnight in terms of moving from in-person, education centers to online delivery platforms, educational platforms. And whilst that may set us on a trajectory that we, has negatives and positives, it also speaks to the pace that change is possible under the right conditions. But nevertheless, there is some very interesting work coming out at the moment on, there's a text called Dark Academia, along with a few other books speaking to, the platformization of education, and how, over the past at least 10 perhaps years in the countries that I've worked in higher education, there has been this kind of dance between the edX platforms, or the educational platform providers, and educational institutes trying to formulate these relationships. But of course, the pandemic provided the kind of perfect storm for that to be really advanced forward. So this is kind of an ongoing conversation in the UK at least, but also some important people working on this in Australia as well, which has some affinity in terms of the educational system with the UK. But also, one of the interventions that we're developing with one of our collaborators called Public Works. The director of Public Works is a woman called Taranj Kansari, and she has set up the only MA on designing the commons effectively in the UK at a university here in London. And so one of our interventions that we're working on is how can we co-develop and co-design a set of education materials, but also build the community and arguably then the institution around that community to actually put some of these ideas about alternative ways of education into practice. Yeah.
Have you learned anything yet from, or have you seen any learnings yet from this endeavor?
I think, I mean, as I kind of mentioned in the talk, probably most people that you speak to who have any kind of practitioner experience working in organizations that are trying to use some sort of alternative form of governance, be that sociocracy as a quite formal method, to more informal, commons governance structures. In my experience, speaking to people, everyone has a story about kind of the weaknesses of these methods and the kind of labored nature of decision making that this requires in terms of, taking a democratic vote on who brings the biscuits to the meeting, and is that really effective? But equally, what we observe is some kind of also perversion in this kind of in peer-to-peer models. So peer-to-peer obviously evokes a certain understanding that may be quite relational in your initial response, but peer-to-peer is also becoming a mode of a mode that is being utilized for certain verticalist structures, insofar as it is becoming about knowledge exchanges that provide entryways to entrepreneurship that do not necessarily continue those peer-to-peer models thereafter. So it's about the continuation and the sustainability of alternative ways of running organizations. And probably a third example, and I'm drawing on some of the work developed by Anais Parada. So thinking about like faux horizontalism, so having horizontalism as an ideal rather than a praxis. Yeah.
Great. Kader, I'm curious to hear about what's happening in the classroom in terms of like first, what comes to mind is democratic decision making, but from what you've been hearing this morning and what you know of Sharon's research, what have you been seeing in the classroom that might be similar?
Well, I mean, I think it probably varies classroom to classroom. I would say that, and again, coming back to this kind of post-pandemic reality, I feel as if there's been a real shift in my own personal teaching, one that is more empathetic, one that is more consultative with the students from the very beginning, even before a class begins, one that engages students throughout that process so that they have some agency in the types of work that they want to do in the class. And I know that that isn't uncommon in graduate education, especially more self-directed programs, but in an undergraduate space, especially in fields that have professional associations connected with them, registrations, accreditations, that's the word I was looking for, things in which there's a standard kind of practice that we've inherited. It's less common to see that more horizontal structure in the classroom space. So I think having the language that Sharon's work is providing to contextualize some of the ways in which we envision a classroom where students, because I feel as if many times, there's this novice student who still needs to learn all of these technical skills and ways of thinking before they can go out and engage with a public with whom they might not be that familiar. And part of that means finding where they have agency, empowering them to think about what that agency looks like, bringing their own personal experience into the classroom as well, where it's appropriate, and valuing that personal experience has meaning and can shape sort of the way in which we think about what we're teaching and what students are learning. And hopefully in doing that, all of the classes that I've encountered, at least in the School of Constructed Environments, we're thinking about socially engaged practice, even if it's just hypothetical, without the ability in a short semester to actually engage with different communities. And quite frankly, without necessarily the students at that point being ready to engage with different communities or having the kind of confidence and agency to do so. To other classes that actually do that work with communities and go out and think about design interventions. In either of those scenarios, modeling that behavior in the classroom, structuring the classroom as a place where there's open opportunity for students to debate and co-create and bring their own lived experience is something that I'm finding to be potentially quite powerful. And also something that while this type of work was going on pre-pandemic, I just feel like there's a disruption that happened that enabled us to have the freedom to think differently about what that classroom space looks like. And in a lot of ways, it comes from this place of compassion and caring. The work that Latha and I do around contemplative engagement and contemplative and mindful pedagogy has a really interesting intersection in this work too, especially when we start thinking about empathy and the studies that have shown that certain types of mindfulness practice encourage a more empathetic perspective from the lens of the practitioner. Also, the notion of interconnectedness and being able to see complex problems and not necessarily think of that there's one solution, that holding this kind of complexity simultaneously to thinking about multiple solutions. And that's something else that arose from some of the work that Sharon's produced is this idea of the frame not being static, and it's not comfortable when that design frame is constantly changing. And so that's another place where I see the kind of intersection of that contemplative pedagogy helping students, at least, and future designers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, I was rambling. Thank you.
No,
for
no,
cutting me off, Emily.
I was going, so I wanted to bring in your contemplative work into this conversation because I think that's a huge part of how we might go about reframing. And so, definitely, I see mindfulness as an entry point, right? And wanted to, and I know there's some questions coming in, and before we get to the questions, I do want to ask both of you, maybe starting with you, Sharon, how do we start as designers and practitioners? How do we start to think differently? How do we start to practice reframing in our own work? Mindfulness is certainly one way, but what else comes up for you, Sharon?
Well, I mean, I think that really speaks to some of the work that Anais is developing, actually, and a certain kind of, rather than entering into a community as the kind of expert designer that has the skill to frame the problem, taking that kind of looking internally at your own preconceptions of what issues may be at play. So thinking about that reflective activity, but that needs to be also informed by critique and challenges to understandings, because for example, when Carter was speaking just now, I was reminded of the commons theory in that is typically comes to mind. Elinor Ostrom's ideas of the commons is heavily critiqued by some theorists of the Global South, who say that Ostrom tried to economize the commons because she was developing her work in response to Hardin. So it's a very economistic way of thinking commons, when in other communities, this is a much more relational, knowledge-based way of living. So there are important kind of distinctions, which I think speak to what Carter is also talking about in even this articulation of commons. And I think from a design, education perspective, we as educators need to step out of design theory and learn from other disciplines. And I'm also reminded of Freire's work on empathy, which I'm sure you're aware of, Carter. Yeah, that responds.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Carter, about how, aside from mindfulness, how we can start to reframe?
I think that that's a big kind of become a bit of a catch-all. I think there's what I've seen more recently in terms of the kind of reframing that's happened. What I'm noticing in the last couple of years is how the conversation around sustainability in particular has shifted as well, to one that, especially in the industry that relies upon buildings and things, it has shifted from something about green products, green buildings, accreditation, different ways of measuring these metrics, and to one that includes social justice and implications on other marginalized populations, which that's been going on, that research has been going on for a long time. What I think is interesting is that that's the lens through which students are approaching it now, just instinctively, which I think is really interesting and speaks to perhaps some of the empathetic approaches that are maybe more inherent in some of the generations that we're teaching now. That's a generalization in a lot of ways, but I do feel like there are students who we're encountering who possess some of this thinking already and have a desire to make change and have been inspired by the especially when it comes to climate, the sort of very real threat that their generation faces more than any. And so leveraging that own lived experience, leveraging and allowing that to come into the classroom, allowing students to reflect upon that and to speak to that, is another tool that decentralizes the instructor as the sort of leader figure in that environment, and more someone who's facilitating a co-learning experience. So perhaps recognizing that these people who are in our classrooms have a lot of very special and important things to offer, and giving them the space to share that is perhaps another entry point into cultivating that sense of empathy that's necessary for thinking about complex design problems.
Right.
It might not happen in sophomore year, but who knows, it will grow over time.
Yes, and that, I think that's why they call this a practice, that we're constantly learning and iterating and growing from what from practice. I don't see myself as an expert. I see myself as a practitioner. So very much like what you're talking about. I know we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Should we maybe take a look at these? So Latha's question is, do you find a specific industry more amenable to the commons management approach, particularly IP-based fields? What are your thoughts about that, Sharon?
Maybe just before I come to that, I think I just have a few thoughts about what Connor was talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
In relation to sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
It's a field I've done a lot of work in a variety of different ways, and the discourse of sustainability has certainly shifted a lot. I think, just coming back again as well to your question about how we can start to reframe or counterframe, I think participating in different communities that think differently about shared issues is very important to foster empathy and to stretch the boundaries of our understanding and to build this kind of a relational approach. Equally, I think that there's been significant shifts in sustainability. So, for example, from sustainability to circular economy, for example, which we can critique as perpetuating a similar type of ideology that precludes any sort of substantive change in this space. So I think this is also why it's interesting to talk about the language we use. In the sense, because it obfuscates how we can actually seek change in that way. But also frames are important because they can work across different ideological positions, even when, so to Latha's question, I mean, I think in my background, where we work in open source hardware, which it draws on the documentation processes of open source software and that type of open access information. But of course, the challenges come in the implementation of hardware solutions or having open source business models. So I would say that's definitely the case. But there are also kind of substantial debates about, the meaning of commons. So some people would contest that Wikipedia is actually a commons because it's not managed by any sort of community within a set of rules. So these are, we need to unpack these more, I think.
Okay. We have a couple of other questions coming in. Apologies for mispronouncing anyone's names, but Yania Pearson is asking, when inviting community-based organizations as partners in the transformation you're discussing, can you talk about how to respond to the parts of them that have been resistant to the notion of real power sharing with community stakeholders? How do you engage them in reflecting on their own conditioning that creates barriers to walking their talk? And, or simply put, what happens when organizational leaders start to resist the process?
It's a great question. I mean, I think we see this in the fossil fuel industry. So, delay tactics, deflection, delay tactics that seek to just push this kind of substantive change that is inevitable and on the horizon further down the line. I think this also speaks to, the work of Andreas Malm, who is maybe a controversial person within environmental activism, but he, in his exasperation with the climate movement, asks for, people to more direct action to deface the structures of fossil fuel capitalism. I think these are legitimate conversations to have at the current juncture after COP26. In the community setting, I don't know, Cotter, do you have anything you would like to jump in on there before I go on too much?
No, go ahead. I'm captivated by the direction and the conversation.
I mean, I think community organizing and community work is a long-term process that it requires a lot of commitment. And I think that the gravity of the issue is imperative, but also these ideas around what is the political opportunity and understanding, well, how likely is it that we can actually implement this change at this given juncture, but not doing that at the cost of longer term change. So this is this moving to more radical type of pragmatic action.
Audrey Jenkins writes, are there other elements to the processes or practices of commoning, like empathy, that need strengthening in reframing work?
I like that the autocorrect was also redrawing, which is nice. I mean, speaking from the classroom context, and again, bringing it back to some of the research and work that Latha and I have been doing, I think there are a couple of ways in which we can empower students to perhaps think differently about the frames that they bring into the classroom from their past experience, such as, exercises that help enable them to look at situations with fresh eyes, with a new way of seeing. I think listening is certainly something that's important, and helping acknowledge where, either through social media or the general culture around the professions of design, have enabled a certain way of thinking about what is an outcome that they should be working towards. And so helping them kind of see the power of those influences and new ways of, perhaps through different types of contemplative exercises, different types of practices and assignments, get away from some of those patterns that are so ingrained in many of us because of our cultural connection and things like social media.
So in the spirit of reframing, I'm going to throw out a question, and I do want to get to Erin's question too. But are there any dangers to employing empathy in our work as designers? And maybe that's a really large question to ask when only 8 minutes left. But I think maybe I'll be provocative here.
I think it's a good question, and it speaks to how we form communities of solidarity, because the very kind of premise of solidarity almost requires an outsider. So I think it's a kind of quite a philosophical question, I would say, actually, but at the same time, this is playing out all the time in the kind of contemporary context. So I'd say yes.
There can be, for sure. Kader, do you have any thoughts about the dangers of empathy?
I guess when it's inauthentic, or if the kind of response that you have to a situation gets in the way of your ability to stand up to it, maybe. In other words, if through that empathy you begin to sort of over-identify with a certain idea that feels like it could be problematic as a designer, because in some ways we have to help people see things differently, and if empathy clouds our ability to do that, I could see that perhaps getting in the way of change and progress.
Yeah, absolutely. It's needed, and maybe too much of it can get in the way. Maybe, and that's probably a simplistic way of putting it. But I want to quickly turn to Erin's question, because Erin's asking a very practical question for students and designers who are creating objects to meet the demand in the market. Erin's asking, could you kindly provide some tangible examples of how reframing could manifest in the work of, product development?
Well, I guess I can speak from my own experience, and if we design a product to go into the market based on the market as it stands, I think that we are, in a problematic situation. But if we start to reimagine or re-articulate the systems of exchange in the world through, for example, explorations in open source hardware, and how collectives or communities can co-produce products in very different ways that foster, exchange or models of sharing that speak to very different ways of living articulated in more radical domains of circular economy, then I think this is a different way of framing our problem and solution. And in terms of the query about why solidarity requires an outsider, because to have solidarity with somebody is to, demonstrate some sort of commitment to their position, and a position necessarily is just that. It's a position, and that can never be a universal thing. But often when we talk about solidarity, we talk about it in relation to contentious issues that are expressed as against something. So that's why I would say that there is always some sort of outsider.
Yeah, I mean, and Erin, it's a great question, and I think one, especially for fields like product design, architecture, interiors, where what we celebrate is this end product. All of our awards, ways in which the kind of manifestation of the process ends up with this thing. I think turning the attention to the upstream impacts of those things could help, so that students as designers become more attuned to what are the impacts of the materials and the things that that they're specifying, that they're using, so that it takes the emphasis off of the downstream final product and puts it onto the process and all of the impacts that have existed before. Sorry, Emily, there's the question in here about subconscious bias as it relates to empathy. And I'm Sharon, I'm wondering if, because in your talk, you mentioned subjective frames. And I just love being able to talk about people's ideas as a subjective frame, and that those can be both positive and negative, right? And so I mean, we see this in our kind of polarized politics. I think you mentioned it within the context of migration. And so maybe that relation, like understanding that there's a term and that there's a way that we can start to think about it as this type of framing can help reveal where our designer bias may come into play. Hopefully I'm reading that correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. And I think we also need to, acknowledge that there are lots of contradictions in what we're saying. Because on the one hand, we absolutely do need to foster empathy with, people that we strongly disagree with, or think we disagree with. But at the same time, I mean, I do think we need to maintain our a degree of antagonism in order to enact change, particularly in relation to climate action. So there are tensions. These are not straightforward relationships.
I'm not sure if we have time for one more question because we're almost at the hour. Does the nature of empathy and learning change when we move from physical interactions to digital ones, as we've been forced to do during the course of the pandemic? How do we make space for new layers of empathy in digital interactions or behind masks?
That's one of those like pandemic disruption reframing kind of things that has come up. And I think it's such a case-by-case experience for everyone in different circumstances, and has a lot to do with to what degree have you developed relationships with people before you moved into a digital context, I think is a big factor in that. And so, it seems to me that just from personal experience, there's a real willingness to speak more openly to a fault in these digital interactions that might be mitigated in an in-person scenario, regardless of if you're wearing a mask or not, right? So for some students, I think that definitely helps feel like they have a space to have a voice. I know the chat feature in Zoom was really popular among students. And how do we replicate some of those things in person so that those students who might not regularly feel like they have a voice can? But it's a super complex question, and one that we're in the middle of it. We're still trying to figure out how that works.
Yes, an ongoing learning experience. Sharon, I don't know if you have any final thoughts to close us out.
Just that, I wholly agree with what Cotter is saying, and I think there are really important things that allow us to think about, transnational citizenship that have happened over the last 2 years now, and we need to maintain some of those. But I'm also very happy to meet my students in person this semester. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for your time and expertise with us this morning.
Yes, so thank you so much, Sharon, Carter, and Emily, for this amazing discussion. And I think this is a great example of, Sharon, you referred to Paulo Freire's work in your talk, and it's a great example of how we have to be in the crucible, in praxis, to constantly iterate between theory and practice, that we could have some great ideas about how things should work and how things can work in the best of the scenarios. And we also have, obviously, how things actually work in not in the great scenario. And so I think, this is an amazing example of a really deep engagement and sense making between a very strong theoretician grounded in practice and very strong practitioners grounded in theoretical education. So I think this is an exciting conversation, and thank you for your time, and thanks everybody for joining us. And as I mentioned, this is the last event of this season, and we will reconvene back in February, and with actually an event focusing on nonprofit and philanthropic sector and social justice issues in that sector, which is going to be led by my another colleague and a very dear friend, Sujata Jesudasan. And so I'm kind of like realizing through the series that how lucky I am and how privileged I am to have all these amazing friends that I can invite to come and lead some of these sessions. And we will be announcing a call for contributions and ideas for next year. So keep an eye out for both an invitation to February event, but also planning for the next year. So from the first year to the second year, we've moved to co-hosting with some other institutions. Next semester, we're going to be co-hosting with Arizona State, India School of Development Management, and a couple of events. And so what we are trying to do is to really build a network of collaborators who are interested from different fields and looking at issues of how to convert organizations and management, how to harness management theory and practice towards social justice issues. That why should we be doing anything? It is for collective well-being and to make the world a little better. And so that's kind of the idea, is to bring people together. So we will be seeking input from all the people. I think we have about 3,000 people who have been associated with this series over the year and a half that we have hosted it. So I will be reaching out with, idea generation for next year. And like everybody's talked about, my dream is to kind of host a conference that we did not have in 2020 back in New York in person 2 days. But the university is not hosting public events in person yet. And I'm hoping things will change, that we should be able to do it at least like in 23. But we will come back. And so watch out for an email for December. So thank you. Yes, Audrey, you can definitely get on the email list. If you have RSVP'd for this, you will be added to the future information. So thank you very much for joining, everybody. Happy holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas breaks. Take some time, and thank you for supporting this series and joining the conversation. All right, bye-bye, take care.